Good morning, Phil. How are you?
Good morning, Dave. I'm great, thank you. Thanks for having
Great,
me.
great to see you. It's been a little while. We need to catch up. So, Phil, what we're going to do is we're going to hand it over to you and to present Ad Lumen. You're going to be covering off Chasm, cyber attack surface management, and I think some of the other great capabilities that Cavelo brings to the table. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. And yeah, just again, on behalf of Cavelo, thank you to Dave. Thank you to Connex for having us. Attack surface management, the missing middle of cybersecurity, right? The missing middle is kind of like a middle child. We all know that they exist. They just don't get a lot of attention. And over time, that can become a problem, right? My fun little analogy here. So who am I? My name is Phil Guerin. I'm a technical account manager here with Cavelo. I've been here for some time. It's been a pleasure watching the platform really mature out into the needs of our various clients and partners. At the end of the day, we're here to help you understand your data and to use those data insights to build and mature strong security and data privacy programs. Now, a little bit of what we're going to talk about as we move through this. I'm not the most well-versed in all of these subjects, but I'm an analogy guy, so I'm going to use them shamelessly anyway. We're going to talk a little bit about football and how that relates to your DLP strategies. We're going to talk a little bit about bears and how about outrunning your fellow campers is no longer really the strategy you want to look at. And we're going to talk about finding enough, right? How do I do enough from a security perspective, enough from a data perspective, and have the data to be able to justify that? So I like to tell this, once upon a time, our lives were a lot simpler when it comes to our data. Right, I got my career started back in London, Ontario, at a company called Infotech. At the time, all of the infrastructure was actually run on premise. Right, it was a server group in a basement of the building that we all worked in. Everything was hosted out of there. Everything was run out of there. Only a few people had a key to the room where all this stuff was stored. And worst case scenario, if something was going wrong, you could open the door, you could pull power, and you just bought yourself enough time to deal with whatever problem you need to. Right? Not the sexiest solution, but an example of how contained things really were. You knew exactly how and who was accessing everything, and we just only had a certain amount of things in that room and a certain amount of things accessing it, and it was pretty limited. Right? And a limit on things, a limit on assets means we have a limit on the amount of data that we're storing, and back then, storage was also very expensive. Now, neither of those things are true. Actually, none of these things are true anymore. Right? We don't have any castle walls. Our data is living in multiple cloud services. They're living in multiple data centers, whether they're physical or virtual, on-prem or co-located somewhere. We've got small armies of employees working all over the world remotely, connecting into all these various systems, pulling copies of data down, doing who knows what with them once they've done that outside of the scope of the infrastructure, which is what we're typically used to managing. And we have way more assets. The storage is negligible in terms of costs, which means we're just sitting on data. We're letting devices and assets produce more data. We're letting services produce more data. And we've kind of gone into Gollum mode in terms of protecting our precious as it comes to the data, because no one wants to delete it because of, well, what if I need it later? We've become hoarders when it comes to data, and that presents a problem. Just like ignoring the middle child for years and years and years, eventually that's going to bite you. So, roundabout way of saying, the attack surface is not just the server room anymore. It's not the server room and the desktops that access it. It's everything and everywhere. It's all of your people. It's their homes and their home environments and their home networks. It's the data in all of these various services. It's the data in your employees' personal cloud services when you're mixing streams when you're not really supposed to be. Right? I'm not supposed to be having my personal cloud storage and my personal data synced up with my corporate asset, because that corporate asset, the liability is owned by my company. If something goes wrong with the data they're in, it's going to be a tough conversation at a minimum, and tough conversations mean a lot of money through like a legal and an insurance process. So let's get on top of the data and really understand what we need to protect. And really just saying here as well, this is no longer a network protection level game, right? Not everything is locked up internally. We can't just firewall our way out of this, and we can't just antivirus our way out of this. We've got to take strong measurements on a regular basis and use that data as our compass to be able to determine where our effective next steps are going to be. So I like this example. this kind of keys off to what I was just saying. Everyone starts the same way, at least from my perspective throughout my career thus far. Everyone deploys antivirus, everyone deploys firewalls. We know we need to do these things. That's the first island in the chain, right? And then a lot of companies and customers that I work with, they feel like they're sitting on the last island in the chain, right? We've deployed AV, we've deployed firewalls, we've got EDR, we've got IPSs and IDSs, we've got a strong NDR service. And I still don't feel as secure as I want to feel. I still don't feel as comfortable as I want to feel, and I don't understand why. And it's because of that feeling keeps creeping into that sentence, right? If you don't have data, you're going to replace that with your feelings about it, right? But if you've done all of that, you're standing at the last island in the chain and looking forward, it's a nebulous question of, well, what do I do next? Because there's no more islands in that chain. Well, again, I'm not an expert on this either, but island chains, fun enough. There's underwater volcanoes. Tectonic plates are constantly moving over time, just like our problems in this space are constantly moving over time. And those volcanoes are erupting and creating new islands in these chains, right? They're creating new opportunities to solve our problems. We just need to be aware that this is happening. So attack surface management is almost like taking a few steps back to gain the perspective and the visibility to understand how to move forward effectively, right? You can't protect what you can't measure. You can't see what you can't measure, right? We just need to actually take down the walls and actually start doing the investigations of what's actually there, who actually has access to it, what the liability risk of all this stuff looks like, and then figure out, well, what are the processes that we want to put against this so that way we're spending effectively on this, right? The whole point of finding enough in a cybersecurity maturity model isn't to do less work, it's to spend less money and be more secure at the same time. You just need to have the data to justify those plans. Measuring your data gives you the ability to focus, right? There's a lot of different attack types out here. And underlying the biggest threat to all these different attack types is the data caught up in an exfiltration, and how that data, the liability of it, is going to be used against the organization over the next 6, 18, 24 months in terms of employee data being stolen, in terms of user data, intellectual property, things like that. Right, we all have a pretty good understanding if our critical systems go down, how much is that going to cost us every hour that these machines are down, which is why we've adopted the strategy of like, well, just go patch all of our critical vulnerabilities. Right, but now with asset growth and data growth, frankly, we can't patch all of our vulnerabilities. We can't even patch really all of our critical vulnerabilities on a cadence that we're happy with. So what's the solution, right? We have to keep focusing. We have to keep setting priorities within this. So at the end of this, if I'm successful here, what I'm trying to get people to think about is, let's not just go out and patch indiscriminately, right? Let's not just look at the severity of vulnerabilities and patch everything above a watermark. Let's take a step back and ask the question, what am I trying to protect? Arguably, I'm trying to protect my data liability being exfiltrated and used against me. And I'm trying to protect critical uptime and those costs of every hour, every day that I'm down. And if those assets aren't involved in those two conversations, reasonable question comes up like, well, why am I spending time patching any of these vulnerabilities? Right? If that system can be down for 3 days or 3 weeks, if it takes me 20 minutes to replay from a backup, why is that not my strategy if there's no sensitive data there to be discovered and be exfiltrated and used against me? Right? If I've got sensitive data on a system, that's a different story. I want to patch everything. I don't care what the severity is. I don't care what the likelihood is. My job is to keep the organization protected against cyber threats, and that liability is the biggest threat. So go close all the gaps where your data matters. Go close all the gaps where there's a high probability of a vulnerability being breached or exploited on one of your critical systems. And beyond that, now you have the data to really find that plateau. Where is enough enough? And again, spend less money, patch less vulnerabilities, and put your organization in a stronger place of protection because of it. It sounds simple, and it is, right? Just like showing some attention to that middle child on a regular basis. This is just a basic TLC thing. This is a basic ongoing hygiene thing. That island has just popped up on everybody, and we're not looking at it yet. We're not having real serious conversations, but that wave has been coming, and we're seeing that wave cresting with a lot of our conversations with our customers and our partners. And it really is straightforward, right? We need to discover all of the assets and all of the data. We need to understand the liability and the risk of exposure to it. We need to investigate how those risks actually impact our business. And then we need to go take action, and we need to do remediation. And again, the challenge within this is there is a lot to discover. There is a lot to investigate, and there is a lot to remediate if the target is everything. The target can't be everything because we don't have the manpower to be able to fill everything. And that's an exponentially growing problem anyway. So you're chasing something that's just getting further and further away from you anyway. So adopt a better strategy using your data. Like I mentioned coming into this, right, our vulnerability patch management strategy is a little bit outdated. Right, if we're just using CVSS severities in order to go patch all of the criticals, we're spending a lot of time patching vulnerabilities on systems where, frankly, we're seeing diminishing or actually net negative returns on that time spent. Right, how much does it cost to keep a system patched, and what's the risk of that system going down or having the data breached? Do the math. Right? If the math stands out in a bad direction, yeah, you've got to focus your time. You have to focus your energies there. If the math leans you in a favorable direction, you don't. Put simpler plans in place, but be able to communicate to people why you're putting those simpler plans in place. Because at the end of the day, there's a core underlying driver of why patch all the criticals is the plan. Right? It helps everybody go home and sleep at night. Because there's a big I don't know what I don't know lurking beneath the surface there. So just go patch everything above a certain severity. But if you understand your data, you understand the criticality of your uptime, you can do a lot more by spending a lot less time. We need to automate this, right? That's just the simple truth of it. We've got so many assets, we've got so much data. Even if we did a manual effort on this, as soon as that manual effort has been completed, a lot of my data has changed. A lot of people are doing new things and different things with those assets that they're using. The data changes, our people change, our deployments change, which means the nature and the weaknesses of this attack surface change on a daily and a weekly basis. Right, so I'm never going to be able to keep up this manually. I need to automate this. That way, all of the discovery and the investigative efforts are as automated as humanly possible. And then all the time I'm spending as a team is spent around strategy around remediation. Right, let's talk about where it matters to jump in. Let's talk about and accept the risk based on the data where it doesn't make sense for us to jump in. Let's put the comm plans together and then go actually execute only on the things that matter. Right, again, if you're automating the rest of that conversation, you've just afforded yourself the time to have those conversations, really tabletop out the impacts of a breach. Right, if my server goes down, well, how's that going to impact us? Well, what was on it? Right, that's the last time you want to ask that question. You want to ask that question a year ago or a quarter ago or at least a few months ago, to the point where you knew what was on it. You knew you had liability standing out. You knew you had an overexposed access model to this. So what did you do about it before someone came in and exploited a vulnerability or clicked on a link? Did you look at the data and get rid of duplicates? Did you get data into the places where it's more well protected and out of the places where it's least well protected? Right? Did you have the conversations about the liability that your organization is going to face based on that breach? And if not, I mean, frankly, like most people are there than not, right? This is an evolving conversation. It's an evolving process. But those are simple conversations to have. We just need to allow ourselves to drive those. And then the nice thing here is I'm not throwing any shade at any other level of the stack, right? Like we need firewalls and antivirus. We need EDR and IPS and NDR services. Every layer of the stack needs to be operating as efficiently as possible, just like a factory floor and all the machines on it. And then again, right, that's why you don't want to ignore that middle child. You don't want to ignore anything in the middle, because your weakest point in that chain is the weakest part of your system. So you need to understand where you're investing and how much you're investing in all the other aspects. And quite frankly, what better way to do so than running consistent measurements to understand, well, where are my real threats? Where is my real liability? And given all the actions that I've been taking, has that actually moved the needle? Have I reduced the liability that my organization is responsible for? Have I reduced the risk of exposure to it? And if I can't answer those two basic questions, what am I lensing my success metrics in terms of my overall data protection and data privacy and cybersecurity actions? Right, we all talk about useless metrics. So we got to bubble it down to something that makes sense. And then again, from our perspective, your data liability and the risk of exposure to it, that needs to be the center point of the conversation. And then you're building out and layering everything else around it. So rather than an island chain, you're actually kind of looking at like a planetary system where there's the things that you're doing ongoing no matter what. And then there's the things that you're building up and tearing down and maturing based on the realities of those measurements. Now, of course, unfortunately, this is exactly why Cavelo is here to help, right? We automate this entire conversation. So we will connect to all of your various cloud services. We will connect to all of your infrastructure elements. We will connect to all of your end user endpoints, and we will build and maintain a data inventory of all of that. How much data do I have across all of these different solutions? How much of that data is sensitive, right? What's the liability lens of that sensitivity? Where is that sensitivity distributing itself across the environment? Where does sensitive data live where it's not supposed to be, right? And how do I get notified of that as these violations are being made? Who has access to all of this data, right? Who's actually been going in and working with all this data? And then where is all of this liability at risk of a breach because we're falling behind or we have a missed strategy on vulnerability management? Or we're not hardening endpoints in a way where we're using the data liability as a lens, or we're not using the critical uptime of those systems as a lens. And then what else is deployed across all of these assets in terms of software deployments that, again, are going to put the asset and the data at risk? And if I'm measuring all of this on a regular basis and I'm tracking all of my known data control violations, well, now I'm not only auditing and reporting all of this, I have the risk of exposure metrics to know where to focus when I'm engaging in data privacy and data cleanup. And I have all the data liability metrics when I'm trying to understand where to focus on patch management on any given day or week. These are the things that are going to help me find that plateau is enough. And again, like, just invest wisely in your cybersecurity program. Don't invest emotionally. Now, how Cavelo helps with the liability, right? So Cavelo is best in class in terms of the accuracy results of the classifications that we're finding. If we're finding financial data, if we're finding personal data, and we're telling you that it's there, it's actionable data, we stand on the shoulders of IBM, who does liability analysis of data breaches every year. So what's the real world cost of ownership of various data types being breached from various organizations? And then how do we integrate that with this conversation? So we do exactly that. We take those weights, we expose that with our classification results. You can tweak and tune this wherever you need to really dial that liability conversation in line with your own internal conversations. And then again, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of credit card numbers. We're talking about a liability that the company faces because of unprotected and exposed data. Now, where to focus? Prioritizing. I mentioned we were going to talk a little bit about bears and football. We've already talked about enough. I've got a couple minutes left here, so I'm going to get through this, and please bear with me. So let's start with the bears. All right, this is one of my favorites. There's a long joke. It's like campers at a campground, hikers in the woods. You know, one bends down to tie their shoe. The other one sees a bear coming up behind them. They joke, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. Knock them down, get out of there, right? As long as I'm not as weak as other people in my space, then I'm a less advantageous target to attack. And that was a great analogy when we're talking about more of an analog and a simpler world. And that's a great analogy because analog worlds have analog bears, right? One bear, three hikers. It's going to have to go for one before it goes for the other one. So you can arguably buy yourself some time in that analogy. But we have too much data. We've got too much assets. We have way too much growth. It's not an analog conversation anymore. It's a digital conversation. And those bears are now digital, which means that bear comes down that path. It sees three hikers. It goes, oh, great. I'm just going to clone myself, copy, paste, copy, paste. Now there's one bear for every single hiker. This is like the Matrix, one machine per every human, right? So you're not outrunning the bear anymore. There is no just be a little bit better than the person beside me. There's so much data. There's some level of value to everybody out there. So people are stealing it indiscriminately and then figuring out a way to classify it themselves to set a ransom against you, so that way you'll pay a reasonable amount of money to get it back, right? So again, the attackers are doing data classification. Why aren't we? And we can't outrun bears that can clone themselves. And then my last analogy here, getting into deploying active DLP functionality more effectively by using data classifications as an insight. So again, I'm not a big football guy. I spent a little bit of time playing it, but I had to be taught all the way through. So please don't ask me questions about football. This is just the best visual thing that I can think about. So imagine you're playing a game and you can't see beyond the line of scrimmage. Defense lines up, offense lines up, everyone's matched up against each other, and then the offense shifts. You can't see beyond the line of scrimmage, so the defense doesn't move. Play runs, And the offense is just running all over you because your defense is not deployed to map to your offense. Right? This is like deploying active DLP technology without having strong measurements of what that environment looks like in the first place. You run those strong measurements, you run that data classification, the liability, and the access insights, all of a sudden you can see beyond the line of scrimmage. So when your offense shifts, your defense shifts with it. Right? You got to measure constantly to update your strategy so that way you're in the right place at the right time to make the right plays. And with that, I hope that helps understand in terms of like enough is enough, right? You can do more with less. I don't have to have, and this is not even possible, but I don't have to have 30 defensive backs lined up every other foot along the line just to be able to hope that I'm going to catch everything everywhere. Let's deploy technology when it makes sense, where it makes sense, and how it makes sense. And that's going to save me time. It's going to save me money. It may even defer spends out for quarters or years that I don't actually need to put in place because I have the data to justify it. Right now, I can go back to my execs, I can go back to insurance, I can go back to auditors saying, you're asking me to do these things, but can you help me understand why? Because this is the position that we're actually in. And a lot of these folks are more amenable to these conversations than you might think. But if you're not coming to them with the data, you're going to have to check all the boxes that they're asking you to do. Because again, you don't have the data. It's the same reason why we're patching all of our critical vulnerabilities or trying to every week, because we don't have the data to justify a better plan. So again, this is what Cavelo helps us do as a roll-up, right? We're scanning for all your data sensitivity, all the weak points to it. We're scanning for configuration gaps. We're scanning for falling behind on vulnerability patching. We're scanning for unapproved software deployments. All of those contextual elements put your assets and your data at risk more than a CVSS score does, right? I got a couple minutes here, so I'm going to talk really quickly about severity versus probability. So most people's, and again, this is a bit of a new conversation, so there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with using CVSS scores as a priority lens. You're using the severity of a vulnerability to know where to go focus and patch. One of my colleagues just used a great analogy, and I'm just going to shamelessly steal it. So what if you have a wooden house in the middle of a forest fire? How that house is built is producing a very high severity within the environment that it's in, right? But what if that wooden house is surrounded by 3 acres of concrete buildings and concrete roads? Well, I'm not so concerned about that forest fire anymore. The severity of how it's built is high because I'm within a forest fire, but the likelihood of that fire making it through all that concrete is pretty slim. But if that wooden house is on a corridor of other wooden houses that go all the way out to the edge, well, now there's a higher percent likelihood that that fire is going to make its way to me. So this is where you want to look at the EPSS scores and the data, as opposed to just indiscriminately going out and patching based on a severity. So wrapping this up here, the world is just growing. Our assets are growing, our data is growing. The level of accountability that organizations are being held to is growing and getting more complex. There's a simple answer here to make a lot of this stronger, to get a lot of these plans back up on the rails and going in the right direction. And it's simply taking the walls down now and measuring where any of that mold might be and where it might have spread. And that analogy, it's measuring the environment and figuring out, do I have data liability problems to worry about? Because if I'm putting my head in the sand on that, that data is going to get breached. I'm going to pay for it. And it's going to cost me 10x or more in terms of reactive efforts than if I just took ownership, said I'm going to be proactive about my data. I'm going to be proactive about protecting the liability of my data. And I'm going to engage in regular hygiene with that, just like I'm already engaged in regular patching hygiene. But at the same time, let's get better and more effective at my patching hygiene while we're at it by leveraging the data insights. So stop ignoring the middle child. Everybody needs some time to develop. When that whole family unit is functioning as strong as they can as individuals, that whole family unit just becomes stronger, right? Individual family members, strong family, strong impact. Okay, now I promise I'm done here. Again, my name is Phil. I'm here representing Cavelo. If you'd like to have a conversation with us, please reach out to Dave, right? Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about your data. I'll talk more about bears. Maybe I'll come up with something about goats for you to kind of keep this more interesting. But until then, again, I want to appreciate Connex. I want to appreciate Dave. Thanks, Mark, for kicking this whole thing off. And I hope to talk to you all soon.
Phil, thanks so much for this. We actually had a couple of questions. I was hoping that you might be able to give us a minute to take a look at them.
Yes, please.
So one of the things that was asked is, and I've had the experience of using Cavelo extensively, even on the platforms we have here within Connex. And surprisingly, I found data I had forgotten about. What's the type of data that's being most discovered, do you think?
The most discovered, and probably the thing that catches most people off guard, is the type of stuff that you would expect. So we find a lot of spreadsheets with a lot of people's names in them. And then with all the names, you've got their street addresses and their emails and their phone numbers and things like that, a bunch of HR information. We find credit card and national identifiers like social insurance numbers and social security numbers all over the place. I mean, frankly, it gets into everything, right? Like people are taking photographs of their driver's licenses, of their passports, and they're sending that around for their own international professional travel. They might have their own personal travel that they're doing at the same time. They've got health records in here. They've got personal family records throughout all this stuff. Fun little anecdote, early days building up the platform, I thought it would be interesting to see what the dashboards and the reports would look like for a perfectly clean asset. It's like, well, I'm a former technical person. You know, I'm the only one who uses my laptop. I know exactly what I'm going to go do, and I know exactly what I want the outcome to be. This is going to be great. Let me get my build together. I'll run an update. I'll run a scan, and I'll see what a perfect world looks like. And then I find social insurance numbers on my laptop. It's like, oh, great, I found a bug. Right? Let's go fix the bug and make the solution better. I look at it for about 30 seconds, and I had just, in between the time of me having this bright idea and executing on it, I did my taxes. And I forgot about it.
Right.
So this is like the most controlled environment that I can think of, and like throwing myself under the bus here, right? Like I'm a technical person who should remember these things that I'm doing them. I know I'm running a data scan on a clean, quote unquote, instance. Now, the reason I throw myself under the bus, we've also seen instances where unknown syncing happens. So one of the big light bulb moments with one of our now customers was, well, let's do like a trial. I don't want to have to go through and get permission to deploy a bunch of internal stuff. Just give me one of your agents. I'll put it on my laptop. You know, I'm the CTO. I can kind of move forward a little bit faster. Let's run a quick scan. I'll put some sample data there. We'll be good. So we do that. We scan it, and we found a lot of HR information, like a lot of social security numbers. It was the entire company listing of all of the employees' names, all of their identifiers, a little bit of payroll information in there. And it was like, how did this get on my laptop? Like, I'm not responsible for this data. He had one sync set up to his like corporate strategy SharePoint, and somebody else in his organization who had access to both HR and corporate strategy copied the wrong file to the wrong subdirectory.
Right.
And because it was so deeply nested, nobody knew about it. It's synced to his laptop. We run the scan on his laptop. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, I don't even have to do anything to move data offside. My systems and other people are just making honest mistakes along the way, and data moves itself.
That's, again, you've hit the nail on the head. As I mentioned, even here at Connex, you know, I found some data that I should not have been storing the way I was on our own. But thankfully, using Cavelo, we found exactly that. Really, the last question I had for you was, I want to touch on some integrations that Cavelo can do with other popular platforms that businesses are using today, whether it be G Suite or perhaps Microsoft and 365 or Teams and SharePoint. Can you elaborate a little bit about that, how Cavelo integrates with those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe we integrate with everything that you just mentioned there. So Cavelo maintains a technology agnostic view to what we connect to. So like I mentioned kind of through the talk there, right? Most organizations aren't in a cloud service. They're in 3 to 5 at minimum. Depending on the maturity, they might be in dozens or multiple dozens of different cloud services. And then all the infrastructure and all the elements that you're interfacing those services with. So we've set ourselves up to be able to integrate with anything that we can get data from or an API layer. We can throw our legs over those bars, so to speak, really quickly and integrate with anything that we need to. So if it's file on a disk somewhere, or if it's a data point that we can get through an API, Cavelo can and will connect to it. And then all of that information, again, comes into one single place. You're not trying to use feature functionality on all these disparate systems and then trying to do all the manual effort to bring this together. And then again, right, if you're doing it manual, by the time you're done, it's all out of date anyway. You have to have something that's like regularly and continuously going in here and keeping the stuff together, keeping the insights up to date, because that's not the job, right? That's just the work effort. The job is understanding what to do with those insights. And that's where your team and your spend is going to be a lot more effective.
Fantastic. Phil, I cannot thank you enough for today. We've already been receiving some messages on from our attendees, really interested in Cavelo, and I think we're going to be having some more conversations with our clients very soon.
Great. Happy to hear so.